I've been running the same night route for almost 8 years, long enough to know every signal delay and dead zone by memory. That's why I noticed when a new station name appeared on my schedule after midnight. It wasn't handwritten or flagged as a revision. It looked official. Same font, same spacing, slotted neatly between 2 rural stops that hadn't changed in decades. I checked the master route map in the cab. The stop wasn't there. I checked again at the next signal. Still not there. But the onboard system insisted I was required to slow and open the doors at 1:03. No passengers were scheduled to board or exit. When we reached the marker, the train decelerated on its own. Outside the windows, there was no platform, no lights, just trees pressed close to the tracks, and something pale standing exactly where the platform should have been. Night routes are built on predictability. The same crossings activate in the same order. The same warning lights flash in the same empty towns. You learn to trust the schedule because it doesn't improvise. Every change is documented, reviewed, and distributed well in advance. Even temporary adjustments leave a trail of bulletins and notices behind them. That's why, in the moment, I didn't immediately panic. My eyes accepted the entry before my reasoning caught up. The system doesn't ask questions when it updates. It assumes continuity, and most nights that assumption holds. I told myself the stop must have been added earlier in the week and slipped past my attention. That explanation felt thin, but it was familiar, and familiarity is what keeps you steady at night. After the stop completed, the train accelerated smoothly back to route speed. The controls responded normally. No alarms sounded, no warnings appeared. Everything behaved as if I had just serviced a legitimate station. I stayed seated, replaying the last minute in my head in precise detail. The pale shape outside hadn't moved. It hadn't waved or stepped closer. It hadn't reacted to the train at all. When I checked the schedule again, the stop was still there. Same name, same placement. No annotation to indicate it was conditional or temporary. It existed in the system the way permanent things do, without explanation or context. That persistence unsettled me more than the sight outside the window. At the next authorized stop, I contacted dispatch on the standard channel. I didn't describe what I'd seen. I didn't mention the figure or the lack of a platform. I only asked for confirmation of the updated schedule segment. The response took longer than usual, just long enough to register as hesitation. The route was confirmed as correct. No additional notes were attached. When I asked about the new station by name, there was another pause. The dispatcher repeated the confirmation without addressing the question directly, then ended the call. The exchange was clean and professional, but it left the impression that I had stepped slightly outside the scope of what was expected to be discussed. I pulled the physical paperwork from behind the seat, printed summaries, old notices, emergency reference sheets that rarely changed. The new stop wasn't listed anywhere outside the digital schedule. There was no mile marker associated with it, no siding reference, no maintenance notes. Rail systems are layered by necessity. Even stations taken out of service leave traces behind in documentation and infrastructure. This one hadn't. It existed cleanly, without residue, as if it had been inserted into the route in isolation, without the surrounding support that normally makes a stop possible. That absence felt deliberate, not accidental. The second night, the stop appeared again. Same name, same placement, same required action at 1:03. This time, I watched the controls instead of the track ahead. As the marker approached, I eased my hands away. The speed dropped on its own, smooth and controlled. Outside, the trees pressed close to the windows, branches flashing briefly in the cab light. There was still no platform, no sign, no illumination. The pale figure stood in the same position, indistinct but intentional, as if it had been placed there to satisfy a requirement rather than to be seen. The doors opened automatically and remained open for exactly 40 seconds. Not a second more, not a second less. No one boarded, no one exited. When the doors closed, the figure was gone, not stepping back, not moving away into the trees, simply absent, as if it had never occupied the space at all. The train accelerated immediately, the system marking the stop as serviced. I felt no relief, only the quiet certainty that I had performed a required action correctly, even though I didn't understand why it existed. After the shift, I reviewed the onboard logs in detail. The stop was listed as completed. Doors opened, doors closed. No anomalies detected. I searched the internal database by station name. No results. I searched by time, by mile range, by event type. The only reference was the entry already embedded in my schedule, repeating itself without explanation. The system wasn't glitching. It wasn't correcting itself. It was being consistent, and that consistency made it difficult to argue against what I had seen with my own eyes. Before leaving the cab, I checked the next night's schedule. The added stop was already there, waiting in the same position between two stations I knew by heart. I stared at it longer than necessary, committing its placement to memory. Whatever this was, it wasn't a one-time error or a temporary misrouting. It had been integrated into the route. The schedule made one thing clear without ever stating it outright. At 1:03, the train would stop, whether anyone was meant to be there or not. By the third night, I stopped thinking of the added stop as a mistake. The schedule loaded cleanly at the start of the shift, and the entry was already there, waiting in the same position. Nothing about it looked provisional. It didn't carry a warning color or a revision marker. It wasn't grouped with delays or maintenance notes. It behaved like a station that had always existed. I checked the time more often than I needed to, not because I was nervous, but because the minute mattered now. 1:03 wasn't just a point on the clock anymore. It was an instruction. The rest of the route bent around it quietly, every signal and slowdown falling back into familiar patterns until that minute approached again. The train reached the marker exactly on time. This time, I didn't look out the window right away. I watched the instrument panel instead. Speed reduction engaged smoothly, without resistance. Brake pressure adjusted itself with practiced precision. The system knew exactly what it was doing. When the doors opened, I felt the interior lights change, shifting just slightly to compensate for the darkness outside. Only then did I look toward the trees. There was no platform, no sign, no lamppost. The pale figure stood where it always had, motionless and centered, like a placeholder occupying a required position rather than a person waiting for a train. I waited for the doors to close, counting the seconds without looking at the timer. 40 seconds passed, and the doors sealed themselves again with a soft, mechanical finality. The figure was gone before the last panel locked into place. As the train accelerated, the system logged the stop as completed. No alerts followed. No notes appeared. According to every internal metric, the train had performed exactly as scheduled. That normalcy disturbed me more than anything else. If the system had hesitated or flagged an error, I would have had something to respond to. Instead, it treated the stop as routine, and that routine left no space for objection. Between stops, I reviewed the rest of the route, looking for any other changes I might have missed. Everything else remained unchanged. Signals appeared where they should. Speed limits engaged and released at the same mile markers I'd memorized years ago. The added stop didn't disrupt the route. It fit into it perfectly. That suggested something I didn't like acknowledging. Whatever had added the stop hadn't forced it in. It had planned for it. The timing, the deceleration curve, the door cycle, all of it had been accounted for in advance, as if the route had been waiting for this instruction long before I noticed it. After the shift, I searched the system logs again, widening my parameters. I wasn't looking for proof of the figure anymore. I was looking for authorization. There was none. No record of a scheduling change. No time-stamped approval. No maintenance directive. The stop existed without an origin. Rail operations don't work that way. Even automated changes leave fingerprints. Someone approves them. Something triggers them. This one didn't. It simply was, nested into the route with the confidence of something that didn't need permission. The fourth night confirmed the pattern. At 1:03, the train slowed. The doors opened. The lights adjusted. The figure stood in place. I felt myself anticipating the sequence without effort, my body aligning with the process the way it does after years of repetition. That scared me more than fear would have. Fear fades. Habit settles in. I realized I hadn't considered refusing the stop, not even as a hypothetical. The system never presented it as an option. It presented the stop as inevitable, and inevitability is difficult to argue with in the middle of a night run. I tried to delay the approach slightly on the fifth night, easing off the throttle a fraction earlier than required. The system compensated immediately, adjusting the deceleration curve so the train still reached the marker at the correct speed and time. I tried again later, accelerating just a touch longer than normal. The response was the same. The system corrected me smoothly, without alarms or resistance. It wasn't preventing deviation aggressively. It was guiding it back into place, the way a well-designed process does when it expects cooperation rather than defiance. The figure never changed. It didn't step forward or retreat. It didn't gesture or turn its head. It remained pale and indistinct, never resolving into detail, no matter how long I looked. That constancy made it feel less like a presence and more like a marker, something placed to indicate where the stop existed in physical space, even if the infrastructure didn't. I began to understand that the stop wasn't appearing for the figure. The figure was appearing for the stop, a visual confirmation that something was being honored exactly where the system said it should be. By the end of the week, the minute had fully integrated itself into my sense of the route. I no longer checked the schedule to confirm it. I knew when it was coming. At 1:03, the train complied. Everything else remained unchanged. That stability created a quiet tension I carried with me, even after the shift ended. If something this precise could exist without origin or explanation, then The system I trusted so completely was capable of accommodating things I didn't understand, and doing so without ever acknowledging that anything unusual was happening at all. On the sixth night, I tried to do what should have been the simplest thing. I searched for the stop before the shift started. Not during the run, not after the doors closed, but early, while the train was still idle and the systems were calm. I entered the station name into the internal reference database, the one conductors use to pull historical notes and platform specifics. The result came back immediately. No reference found, not inactive, not deprecated, just absent. The schedule still showed the stop clearly, formatted like any other. The database insisted it had never existed. Two parts of the same system were now holding incompatible truths, and neither acknowledged the conflict. I expanded the search. Alternate spellings, older abbreviations, numeric codes tied to mile markers. Nothing resolved. The database behaved normally, returning results for every other stop on the route, including ones taken out of service before I was hired. This wasn't a missing record. It was a boundary. The system allowed the stop to exist operationally, but refused to support it informationally. I could act on it. I could not learn about it. That distinction felt intentional, like a rule I wasn't supposed to test too directly. At 1:03, the train slowed as it always did. I watched the windows this time, not the controls. The trees blurred, then resolved again as we stopped. The figure stood in its place, unchanged, pale and indistinct against the dark. I resisted the urge to lean forward. Something about the moment felt narrower than before, as if the margin for deviation had shrunk. When the doors opened, the interior lights spilled outward and revealed exactly what they always had. Empty track. No platform, no sign of construction or decay. The system didn't want me closer. It wanted the action completed cleanly. After the doors closed, I checked the logs again, this time focusing on timing. The stop registered as serviced down to the second. Door cycle, brake release, acceleration, all within expected tolerances. There was no indication that anything unusual had occurred. That was the problem. The system was precise enough to record minor deviations elsewhere on the route, but here it showed no interest in additional detail. The stop existed only at the level required to execute it. Anything beyond that was treated as unnecessary. I contacted dispatch again, choosing my words more carefully. I didn't ask about the station itself. I asked whether there were any restrictions on discussing route modifications during active night runs. The answer came back quickly this time. There were no restrictions. Nothing else followed. The message closed cleanly, like a completed transaction. It felt less like reassurance, and more like a reminder that the question itself hadn't been relevant to whatever was actually governing the route. I noticed then that the onboard help system no longer suggested related queries when I typed the station name. Normally, partial entries triggered drop-downs and cross-references. This one didn't. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for input it had no intention of resolving. The schedule, however, remained unchanged. The stop stayed where it was, perfectly integrated. The system wasn't hiding information. It was declining to provide it, and it did so without signaling error or concern, as if the absence of context were a feature rather than a problem. That night, I tried something small. I delayed opening the doors by a single second, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to register as hesitation. The system compensated immediately. The doors opened anyway. The delay absorbed and corrected so smoothly it felt intentional. The stop completed on time, the log reflecting a flawless sequence. I understood then that precision mattered more than compliance. The system didn't require my agreement. It required the outcome, and it was willing to adjust around me to get it. The figure never reacted to the delay. It remained fixed in place, unchanged, as if it were not observing the train at all. Its purpose wasn't interaction. It was confirmation, a marker the system used to anchor something intangible to a physical point on the route. I stopped thinking of it as someone waiting. I started thinking of it as part of the infrastructure, something placed where a platform should have been because the schedule insisted that a platform existed there, whether the world supported it or not. By the end of the shift, I understood the boundary clearly. I could operate the stop. I could not investigate it. The system allowed action, but denied inquiry. That imbalance settled uneasily in my thoughts. Rail work depends on understanding the terrain as much as following instructions. Here, understanding had been quietly removed from the process. The stop would appear. The train would slow. The doors would open, and nothing I was permitted to ask would ever explain why. The first measurable change came not at 1:03, but before it. A minor delay appeared 2 stops earlier, subtle enough that a less experienced conductor might have ignored it. A signal held a few seconds longer than usual. A speed advisory lingered after I acknowledged it. Nothing dramatic, just enough to stretch the run slightly. By the time the train reached the added stop, the timing aligned perfectly anyway. The system had compensated upstream, redistributing small delays so the minute remained intact. That was when I understood the stop wasn't adapting to the route. The route was adapting to the stop. I reviewed previous runs from memory, reconstructing the night in reverse. The added stop had begun to act like a fixed anchor point, something the rest of the schedule revolved around. Signals adjusted, buffer times shifted, even radio check-ins seemed to cluster differently as the minute approached. The system wasn't reacting in real time. It was planning ahead. The stop existed as a priority event now, something the route protected by smoothing everything around it. That kind of behavior wasn't meant for temporary changes. It was how the system treated infrastructure it considered permanent. At 1:03, the train slowed and stopped as always. The trees pressed close to the windows, dark and unbroken. The figure stood in place, unchanged, its pale shape absorbing the cab light without reflecting it back. I noticed something new then. The silence felt structured, not empty, but held, as if the sound of the train idling were being contained within the moment rather than spilling outward. When the doors opened, the air inside the cab shifted slightly, pressure equalizing the way it does at legitimate stations. The system behaved as if a platform truly existed there, even when every visual cue denied it. After the stop completed, the train resumed speed more gradually than usual. The acceleration curve was smoother, less abrupt, like the system were prioritizing stability over efficiency. I checked the energy readouts. They were within normal range, but the distribution had changed. The train was working differently now, not harder, but more carefully. The implication settled slowly. The stop wasn't just a point on the schedule. It was influencing how the train moved through the rest of the route, subtly reshaping the journey to accommodate itself. The next night, I felt the change before I saw it. The cab felt quieter, the usual vibration dampened just enough to notice. As the route progressed, I realized the system had altered braking patterns at several minor crossings, shorter warnings, longer deceleration. All of it pointed toward the same outcome. By the time 103 arrived, the train glided into the stop with practiced ease, like it had been doing this for years. The figure stood waiting, unchanged, its presence steady in a way that made the surrounding forest feel temporary by comparison. I checked the physical environment more closely after that. Trees near the track showed signs of repeated disturbance, not heavy damage, just broken branches and compressed undergrowth in a narrow band where none should have existed. There was still no platform, no concrete, no ties beyond the rails themselves, but the land looked used, as if something had been arriving there regularly, even when no train was present. The schedule had not only inserted a stop, it had begun to assert it physically, pressing routine into a place that had never been prepared for it. Dispatch began to sound different after that, not evasive, just less precise. When I referenced timing changes, the responses came back generalized, framed in averages instead of specifics. The route was within acceptable parameters. Minor variances were expected, no corrective action required. The language suggested closure, not conversation. The system no longer wanted feedback about adjustments it had already decided were correct. It treated the stop and its effects as settled matters, no longer open for review. At 1:03 on the 10th night, the figure shifted slightly, not forward or back, but sideways, aligning itself more squarely with the door that opened. It was the smallest movement I had seen yet, and it stopped me cold. The doors closed 40 seconds later. The figure was gone. When I checked the logs, the stop registered as normal, no deviation, but the route afterward felt altered in a way I couldn't quantify, like a line had been redrawn somewhere beneath the system's surface. By the end of the week, I stopped thinking of the stop as something that appeared. It felt more accurate to think of it as something the route had been missing. The schedule flowed into it now, the surrounding timing shaped to support it. The train behaved as if it had always been meant to stop there, and the land itself was beginning to reflect that assumption. Whatever existed at 1:03 no longer depended on being noticed. It had become part of the route's logic, and I had the growing sense that removing it would no longer be as simple as deleting an entry from a schedule. By the second week, the added stop no longer felt new. It felt assumed. The schedule loaded with it already in place, and my eyes stopped catching on the entry the way they once had. That realization disturbed me more than surprise ever did. The system had succeeded in normalizing the anomaly by repetition alone. I noticed that other aspects of the route now referenced 0103 indirectly. Crew reminders adjusted, energy usage projections shifted, even automated maintenance checks clustered earlier in the night, as if the system preferred to settle variables before the stop occurred. Nothing announced this change outright. It was implied, embedded in timing and distribution. The schedule didn't just require the stop anymore, it expected it. I reviewed my own behavior and didn't like what I found. I was preparing for the stop without consciously deciding to, slowing my speech on radio calls as the minute approached, clearing my workspace in advance. keeping my hands closer to the console. The system had trained me without instruction. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't just an automated process executing instructions. It was an environment shaping compliance through routine. The stop didn't need enforcement because the conditions around it made enforcement unnecessary. At 1:03, the train slowed. The doors opened. The figure stood in place. I felt no hesitation at all. That night, I noticed a new entry in the advisory panel, not tied to the stop directly, but adjacent to it in the system's logic. A recommendation to maintain current operational posture during late-night segments. It wasn't a command. It was phrased as guidance. The kind operators are encouraged to follow for efficiency and safety. The timing aligned too neatly to ignore. The system was no longer just accommodating the stop. It was shaping the human element around it, ensuring nothing interfered with its execution. At the stop, the forest felt closer than before. The trees pressed in at sharper angles, branches reflecting light in brief, broken patterns. The figure stood exactly where it always had, pale and still, but the alignment was different. It matched the door more precisely now, centered with an accuracy that felt measured. When the doors opened, I felt a subtle shift in air pressure, stronger than usual. The cab compensated automatically, systems adjusting to conditions they believed were legitimate. The stop was no longer pretending to be part of the route. The route was now pretending it had always led here. After the shift, I checked external timetables out of habit, public-facing schedules, archived PDFs. None of them listed the stop. That discrepancy had existed from the beginning, but now it felt intentional rather than incomplete. The system I worked within no longer aligned with the one passengers were allowed to see. There was an internal version of the route and an external one, and they diverged precisely at 1:03. I realized then that the stop wasn't hidden. It was restricted. It existed only for the systems and personnel required to service it. On the following night, the train decelerated slightly earlier than expected, not enough to break protocol, but enough to feel anticipatory. The system was no longer waiting for confirmation. It initiated the sequence based on projection rather than position. At 1:03, the doors opened as usual. The figure stood in place. This time, I noticed the absence of something else. There was no sense of waiting. The stop didn't feel like a pause anymore. It felt like a transfer of responsibility, brief and efficient, before the train resumed its role in the larger process. I considered what would happen if the stop were missed, not delayed, missed entirely. The thought didn't produce fear. It produced resistance. The idea felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like skipping a required step in a safety check. The system never presented the possibility of bypass. There was no override listed, no conditional logic that allowed for non-compliance. The stop wasn't optional because the schedule said so. It was non-optional because the rest of the route depended on it. That night, the figure proved again, just a fraction, adjusting its stance as the doors opened. The movement was economical, precise, like a correction rather than a decision. I watched carefully, aware that I was witnessing a refinement rather than a change. The figure wasn't becoming more human. It was becoming more accurate. When the doors closed, it vanished as before. The train accelerated smoothly, the system logging the stop without comment. I understood then that whatever the stop was for, it wasn't finished being optimized. By the end of the shift, the realization settled fully. The schedule wasn't reacting to the stop anymore. It was built around it. Every adjustment, every recommendation, every silent correction pointed toward a single conclusion. The system had identified a requirement it could not ignore, and it had reorganized itself accordingly. At 1:03, the train would always stop, not because I was there to make it happen, but because the schedule now assumed that someone always would be. The idea of skipping the stop didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in slowly, the way unwanted thoughts do when there's nothing else left to test. I didn't frame it as rebellion. I framed it as verification. If the stop was truly required, then the system should respond to its absence. On the 12th night, I prepared carefully. I followed the route precisely until the minute approached, keeping every other variable clean. No early braking, no late acknowledgments. I wanted the deviation to be singular and undeniable. At 1:03, I kept my hand steady and did nothing. The system reacted immediately. The first response wasn't forceful. The deceleration engaged smoothly, the way it always did, as if my inaction had been anticipated. I countered gently, maintaining speed just above the threshold. The system adjusted again, correcting with practiced ease. There were no alarms, no warnings, just a quiet negotiation in control inputs that ended with the train slowing anyway. By the time we reached the marker, the speed matched the expected profile perfectly. The doors opened without waiting for confirmation. The system logged the stop as serviced. It hadn't overridden me. It had bypassed me. The figure stood outside as usual, pale and still, aligned with the door more precisely than ever. I watched it closely, aware that this was the first time I had tried to deny the process directly. Nothing about the stop reflected resistance. No delay, no hesitation. The doors closed after 40 seconds. The train accelerated smoothly, the system marking completion without comment. The logs showed no anomaly. According to the record, I had complied fully. The system had rewritten the interaction to preserve the outcome it required. I tried again the following night, this time earlier. I initiated a manual slowdown well before the marker, then accelerated past the expected point of deceleration. The system compensated upstream, adjusting signal timing and braking curves so the final approach still aligned with 0103. It wasn't reacting in the moment anymore. It was planning ahead. The stop occurred exactly as scheduled. The figure stood in place. The doors opened and closed. The train moved on. I realized then that deviation wasn't being prevented. It was being absorbed. After the shift, I searched the advisory logs for the first time. Not errors, recommendations. The messages operators rarely read because they rarely matter. One entry stood out. Operational consistency preferred. No timestamp, no reference. Just a general guideline that had been inserted quietly into the system. It wasn't tied to the stop by name, but it aligned perfectly with it. The system wasn't forbidding deviation. It was classifying it as inefficient, and inefficiency in automated environments is corrected automatically. I began to feel watched in a way that had nothing to do with cameras. The system anticipated my actions before I took them, adjusting parameters to maintain the route's integrity. My inputs were no longer decisions. They were suggestions evaluated against a preferred outcome. At 1:03, the stop executed with flawless timing. The figure remained unchanged, its presence steady and impersonal. Whatever role it served, it didn't depend on my participation. The system had ensured that, by redesigning the process around predictability rather than control. On the 15th night, I attempted a more drastic test. I initiated a fault report seconds before the stop, citing a non-critical sensor discrepancy, the kind of report that normally triggers a pause or delay. The system acknowledged the report and queued it for review. Then it proceeded with the stop anyway. The doors opened. The figure stood in place. The cycle completed. The fault report cleared itself moments later, marked as resolved without intervention. The system had evaluated the disruption and decided it wasn't relevant. That was when the pressure behind my eyes changed. It no longer peaked and faded cleanly at 1:03. It lingered, dull and persistent, as if the system were maintaining alignment beyond the minute itself. The stop wasn't an event anymore. It was a state. The schedule no longer revolved around it because the route had fully integrated it. Every attempt I made to interfere only confirmed that integration, reinforcing the system's confidence in its own design. By the end of the week, I stopped thinking in terms of control. I thought in terms of accommodation. The system didn't need me to agree. It needed me to be predictable. At 1:03, the train stopped. The doors opened. The figure stood, and I understood that the process would continue whether I participated consciously or not. The system had moved past the point where human intention mattered. All that remained was execution. On the last night, I tried to fight it. I didn't start with the stop. I started with the route itself. I arrived early, checked every bulletin, reviewed every known delay window, and walked the cab through its full pre-run routine with more care than I had in months. I wanted the night to be clean. I wanted the system to have nothing to correct except my choice. The schedule loaded, and the added station was already there, unchanged. Same placement, same font, same quiet certainty. There was no revision marker because the system no longer treated it as a revision. It treated it as a fact. The longer it stayed, the more it behaved like something that had always been true. I contacted dispatch one final time, choosing the kind of language that normally opens doors instead of closing them. I didn't ask about the station by name. I asked whether the onboard schedule could contain stops that were restricted from operator documentation. The reply came back too quickly, too smooth. All operational stops were accounted for. No exceptions. Nothing else. The message ended cleanly, as if my question had been processed and filed as irrelevant. It didn't feel like a person refusing to answer. It felt like a system confirming that the category I was searching for did not exist, even as I watched that category run every night at 1:03. As the hour approached, the route began adjusting around the minute in ways I could feel in the cab. Signals held a fraction longer, then cleared with perfect timing. Speed advisories appeared earlier and remained longer, smoothing the approach. The train was being guided into alignment before the marker even came into view. The stop no longer happened because we reached it. We reached it because the stop was scheduled to happen. That inversion changed how I experienced the run. It wasn't a journey with a strange interruption anymore. It was a procedure designed to deliver the train to a point in the woods at exactly 1:03. no matter what the rest of the night required. At 1:03, the deceleration engaged with the same calm precision as always. I kept my hands off the controls. I let the system do what it clearly preferred to do. The trees pressed close, dark and silent, offering no hint of a platform or a service road. The doors opened. The interior lights spilled outward. The figure stood in place, pale and indistinct, aligned with the open door like a measurement line rather than a person. I watched it without leaning forward, without searching for detail I had never been allowed to receive. The figure didn't react because reaction wasn't part of its function. It existed to confirm that the stop existed, even when everything else insisted it did not. For the first time, I noticed that the air outside the door didn't behave like open night air should. It didn't rush in. It didn't carry sound. It felt dense and held, as if the space beyond the threshold belonged to a different set of rules. The cab's systems compensated automatically, adjusting pressure and temperature as if we were stopped at a legitimate station with expected environmental conditions. 40 seconds passed. The doors closed. The figure was gone. The train accelerated, and the forest returned to its ordinary darkness. The transition was clean, almost polite, as if the stop were a formal exchange completed exactly on schedule. I checked the schedule immediately after, not because I expected it to change, but because I needed to confirm what the system believed. The stop remained listed, untouched by my attention. No warning appeared. No note indicated the irregular nature of what had occurred. The system logged success, and success was all it cared about. I realized then that my attempts to understand had never been the threat. The real threat would have been refusal, and refusal had already been engineered out of the route. There was no button for it, no override path. The system had grown around the stop until compliance became the only operationally stable state. By morning, I stopped framing the situation as a mystery. Mysteries suggest answers, and answers suggest closure. This had none. It had repetition. It had procedure. It had the steady confidence of something that would continue whether or not anyone believed in it. The added stop didn't need proof. It needed execution, and execution was guaranteed by the same mechanisms that kept trains on time and signals synchronized across hundreds of miles of track. The system used that reliability like a lever, turning routine into enforcement without ever admitting it was doing so. I kept my job because there was nothing to report that the system hadn't already decided was normal. The logs were clean. The metrics were stable. Every stop on paper aligned with every stop in practice because the system had written the paper after the fact. The only difference was what I carried with me after the shift ended, a quiet awareness that the route I thought I knew had a segment that existed only at night, only after midnight, and only at the minute the schedule demanded. The stop was not a glitch. It was a maintained condition, and once a condition is maintained long enough, it becomes part of reality for everything connected to it. Now, when midnight passes, I watch the schedule without expecting it to remain the same. I wait for 1:03, the way you wait for a signal you can't ignore, not because it's loud, but because the entire system depends on it being obeyed. The train slows. The doors open. The forest offers nothing that resembles a station, and the pale figure stands where the platform should have been, doing its quiet work of confirmation. Then the doors close, the figure disappears, and the route continues as if nothing unusual has happened at all. By morning, the public timetable remains unchanged, clean and reasonable. Only the onboard schedule remembers the stop, because only the system needs it to exist. The city is quiet now. You should be too.